So I guess that's tip number one. Don't leave your wood laying out in the sun if you don't want it to be UV damaged. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, we're working through a renovation on this 1956 Calcraft, and last week we did some prep work on our walls to get them ready to go on the camper deck, but we are not doing that this week because I ran into some trouble and doing the second wall took me a lot longer than I thought it was going to. I said I ran into a problem. Well, the big problem was that I was a lazy camper rebuilder, and I finished this wall, and then we had some nice weather, so I just left it sitting out on the driveway while I got busy doing other things. Well, the problem with that is when you leave wood setting in the sun, it does tend to yellow. If I hold up a unyellowed piece against there, you can see there's a not insignificant difference between these two. We really wanted to stay away from the yellow. That's the whole reason we were using the polycrylic, because polycrylic doesn't tend to yellow like a polyurethane does, but polycrylic does tend to be a lot more difficult to apply. So if I didn't care about the yellow, I'd just do polyurethane. But since I'm trying to avoid that, I had to solve it. So to solve the yellowing of the surface, I had to take my little handy dandy sander and sand the entire surface 2-3 times to get it back down to wood that hadn't yellowed. So it put me behind on a lot of other things, but that was the start of my second wall odyssey. So anyway, I learned a lot about this process in finishing this second wall, and I thought I'd share with you some tips and tricks that I worked out to make this process a little smoother. A little smoother. Finish. Get it? So what tools do you need if you're going to use a sprayer? Well, obviously, in my case, you need an air compressor. You also, of course, need a spray gun. You need a strainer, a few mixing tools. You'll definitely want to have a sander and something like a bucket to wash up in. So one thing a lot of people struggle with is having too small of an air compressor. If you're using any kind of spray gun, I would probably recommend something a little bit larger, like this 30-gallon air compressor here. Air-cooled, oil-cooled, doesn't really matter. Air-cooled is going to be a lot noisier, but cheaper. If you're spraying any kind of oil-based materials, I would definitely get a vapor separator for it. They're pretty cheap, and they will make your finish a lot better. Now your strainer kind of goes hand in hand with your mixing tools. I use one of these disposable mixing cans to thin my finish into, and I use this little graduated mixer from my darkroom kit to measure out the water to finish ratio. Then of course you want to use your strainer when you pour it into your spray gun to avoid getting any kind of gobbledygook from either your paint mixing stick or from the lip of the can that you pour into here. For sanding, I would use a random orbital sander. This is just a 5-inch one. And the reason you want to go with a random orbital sander is because these won't leave, theoretically, any sanding marks on your surface, because not only does this spin, it also moves around in this direction, so no abrasion travels in the same direction twice. When it comes to getting a nice finish on any project, the key is the sanding. When I do a project like this, after I've filled all the nail holes, I'll come back and wipe it smooth just with water. That kind of helps raise the grain a little bit. Then I'll give it a nice even sanding all the way across using 220 grit sandpaper. And before I do anything else, I make sure that that is a nice clean surface. So I'll even take my air compressor, blow everything off, and then I'll come back with my rag and I'll wipe everything smooth. And then I do that same process between each coat that I put on here. Sand it, wipe it, spray it, and then the very last coat doesn't get a sanding. Now let's talk a little bit on how you set up your spray gun. Practice makes perfect, so you're going to want to try this out a little bit before you do your final project. When I'm setting it up, usually I just put water in here so I can see what adjusting these little knobs is really doing for me, but I'll tell you basically off the bat, most of these guns are set up the same way. Some have a different amount of knobs, but this is pretty common here. So if you look, there's this top knob right here, and screwing that in or out is going to change whether you have a spot or whether you have a fan or essentially a line of paint. What you want for spraying this on is a nice fan line, so it sprays out, you know, kind of like that. So you can either go this way or go this way. You can change the direction of that by rotating this little piece on the end. It always comes out in between here, so like this or like this. When I painted this, I wanted my fan to be horizontal, so you kind of set it like that and then just lock it down. So with your fan set, let's talk about how you set your air and your flow. This one right here is for your flow. Take this all the way out. There's a needle in there, and that needle goes in and sets in this little tip. And how far in you screw this little piece controls kind of the rate at which your fluid here flows out of the end of your gun. Now on this one, I will say that there's not a huge difference between in and out. These cheaper guns just don't quite give you the fine control like that. But for spraying on polycrylic, you actually want a pretty heavy flow. You don't want it so heavy that you'll get drips or runs on the surface, but you certainly want it to come out reasonably thick. So you will want to play with that a little bit to see what's best. I would almost recommend getting a spare piece of plywood, you know, a 4x4 handy panel or something, and work on that a few times before you do your final. So right now I've actually got mine set to where it's about maybe a little closer to the middle point in terms of its range. Like I said, experiment in, out a little bit, you might find better results. This bottom little doodad here, that controls your air flowing into it. If you run it all the way one direction, there won't be any air coming out at all. You want a reasonably low amount of air here so that the droplets aren't just blown to smithereens. Too much air will also cause this to, I think, dry quicker. Certainly I experienced that as a problem at one point. So I dropped the air down to where it was just enough to atomize it. And you can tell that when you're playing with it. At one point you'll be getting just a stream essentially out of the gun, and at another point you'll be getting a fan, and you might want to dial it up just a little bit from that and get it nice and smoothly coated. Like I said, you can kind of dial these in a little bit just with water in here, but you'll want to put your actual material that you're spraying in and then make those final adjustments. And that's why you might want to have a separate handy panel just to do some test strokes on. Oh, one more thing. If you're doing your practice sprays and you notice that you're not getting a nice even coat all the way down, it's you know, looks kind of dry in some areas, it's probably because you don't have enough fluid flow. So you might try adjusting this, or it could be that you've got too much air coming in, so you might back this off a little bit, as long as you're still getting a nice fan out the end. So let's talk a little bit about how to thin poly. Now they don't recommend thinning on the actual package, but what I've read online is that you can thin it up to about 10% or so. Some people say up to 20%, but I would tend to keep it on the low side just because you don't want to change the material too much. So I went with about 10%. I took my little graduated cylinder, beaker, whatever you want to call this. And I only mixed up 500 milliliters at a time. And that was enough to do one complete wall and then a little. So I probably could have backed it off to maybe around 400, but I wanted to make sure I had enough to do it in a single pass. At 500 milliliters at a time, I was doing 50 milliliters of water in this, pour that into my little disposable can, and then add an additional 450 milliliters of the actual polycrylic. Give that a good stir. Don't shake it up because that can introduce air into it, which will be a little bit problematic for your finish. But stir it up and then pour it through my strainer into my gun, and away I go. So when it comes time to actually spray onto the wall, the first one I did laying horizontal like this because I thought it would be easier for some reason. Not easier at all. Bad idea. For the second one, I leaned it up against my canopy here, set it on some boards on top of a tarp so that when I got my spray gun all the way down to the bottom, I didn't wind up blowing dirt up onto it. And that worked really well. Super, super easy. You want to be able to reach all the way to the top and get all the way to the bottom in one nice smooth stroke. You know, you could go horizontally, but since the wood grain's oriented vertically, it's best to follow the grain of the wood just to make sure that, you know, any kind of streaking is a little bit more disguised. But ideally you won't have any streaking because spraying makes that nice and easy. So the basic spray technique is the same for this as it is for anything else. Nice even strokes, continuous speed, start off of the material, spray onto the material, and continue off of it again. And then, quite simply, be careful. Be consistent. Overlap each stroke by around 30% and you should be good. It really helps if you can get some kind of cross lighting across it so you can see where you have fresh material sprayed on versus dry. Certainly when you sand between coats, you can tell there's a difference between uncoated and coated. But the more you can see where you've sprayed, the better off you're going to be for putting the next strokes on. And if at any time during spraying you notice that it's not going on quite as smooth, you might stop and check the end of your gun to see if any of the air holes have become clogged with material that's starting to dry. Polycrylic dries really quick, and so before you even get done, it might be drying on the tip of your gun. If it does, take that, clean it off real quick, and get right back to spraying. That aside, it's pretty simple, but it helps to practice. Again, that's why it might be helpful to have a handy panel or some kind of scrap wood that you can practice on before you get right into it. So the only other step really to spraying it on is to let it dry for a couple hours. You don't want it to be tacky or anything at all. And then you come back, sand the whole surface, and then wipe it very cleanly. Let it dry, start your next coat. The only kind of pain in the butt aspect of that process is if you've got it standing up, you kind of got to lay it back down to sand it very well. So, you know, it would help to have an extra set of hands if you're doing something this large, but, you know, I managed to move it by myself. It wasn't that big a deal. It is absolutely important that you get all of the nibs that you've sanded off and anything off before you start spraying that next coat. Don't leave anything on that surface. It should be nice and smooth, and you can, you know, tell by just running your hand over it whether you've got it good and clean or not. I would do 3 or 4 coats minimum to have a nice durable finish. When you get to the last one, you should have a nice smooth surface. If it's really windy out, it might be a bit of a problem, but because this stuff dries so quickly, you might wind up with fewer bits of dust and stuff in the finish than you would if this were oil base. So I think that pretty much wraps that up. This was a bigger project than I thought it was, but I learned a lot. I hope some of the things that I learned can help you out. And if I didn't explain something or I left something out, please just ask in the comments. I'll be happy to let you know as best I can, keeping in mind that I am technically an amateur at this. I'm happy with the finish on this. Thanks for watching. New videos come out every Sunday, and we'll see you next week.